Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me for another Iron Age comic review. And we're taking a look today at Disintegration Street Volume 5. This is the end of Brenden Swan's Disintegration Street saga. I've reviewed every book in this series, so I'm not going to recap a whole lot of it here. If you're interested in those reviews, you can find them on the channel, as well as some interviews of the other stuff he's done, kind of in the same universe, but not directly connected to this story. So if you want a sense of what all those stories are about, and what I thought of them, I encourage you to check those out. I'm really not going to be recapping my thoughts a whole lot here. Now, what I should say is that this really pays off everything that's been set up till now. And I actually think it would be better if you're a prospective reader looking to get into the series, go back and rewatch some of the earlier videos in this review, because this is the culmination of all the things he set up. He does a pretty good job of wrapping everything up. But if you didn't like what you saw before, I don't think you're going to like this either. And this is a book that is very much to taste. So, what kind of a story is it? What do I think of it? And what do I think of the series as a whole? I am going to discuss all of those things. I'm going to follow my usual format. I'm going to give a broad review where I avoid spoilers. Then there will be a spoiler warning, and I'll discuss a little bit of specific critiques. And finally, since this is the end of the series, I'm going to say a few things about what I think of Disintegration Street overall. Let's start with the form factor. This is, I believe, a 9x6 book. It fits very nicely in the hand. Very easy to carry with you. You can flip it in with your tablet cover if you carry an e-tablet, or if you have a backpack, it will fit very nicely in there, nestled on top of school books or whatever else you carry in your backpack, on top of a laptop case. It's very well suited to any of those carrying conditions. I really like that about this size. It does create some problems with the art in this volume. I'm going to discuss that more when we talk about the art. The book itself is perfect bound. It's a soft cover. It's not a hard cover, which is fine, especially at this price point. I don't think there's any issue with that. The paper, as you know, I have a bugaboo about paper in my comics. I don't like a high gloss comic. I think it kind of distracts a little bit from the art, makes it harder to read, especially at a glance. This is a very matte or satin kind of a finish. I think it suits the art very well. Personally, this is the kind of finish I would like to see in all comic and art books, but you know, I don't set an industry standard there or anything, so it is what it is. All in all, a great physical product, as Brenden's books have been from the beginning. Visually, Swan has a very interesting style. It's a mix of whimsy and surrealness. And those two things actually go together pretty well. If you've ever read or watched Alice in Wonderland, you know that those two kind of things are not in any way at odds. And Swan, I think, really knocks that feeling out of the park. You can kind of see that whimsy here on this page. We have these people dancing around. A little girl, she looks very happy. She's frolicking with the forest creatures. But then one of them dies, and we have this scene of her kind of crying at a grave tablet, surrounded by a bit of color. Especially in this book, the flashback sequences do a really good job of conveying a spotlighting or a sense of surreality without losing the overall tone and tenor of the story, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute here. But shortly after this, we go right to the scene where a person is getting stabbed to death. Oof, severe, right? And very well illustrated to play up kind of that sense of shock and of horror that would come from seeing something like this. Swan handles both of these very well, but he handles it in a style that is very impressionistic, perhaps, very loose and cartoony, certainly. And it may not be for everyone. If you look at the cover of a Disintegration Street book and you look at that art, and you're like, I don't know if I can get invested in a story like that. I mean, Swan illustrates all of his covers, so I think they're very good advertising for his art style, actually. And if you don't like it, the book itself is not going to sell you on the art style. It is what it is. I find it very interesting to read. I really like a certain amount of surrealness in my art. And while you can have too much, I don't think that Swan goes over that line in any of these books. So I've appreciated it for that in every volume. However, as time has gone on, it has become less of a mystery story and more of a supernatural battle story. Now, from the beginning, I've characterized this as a blend of Scooby Doo and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It has these supernatural power battles that play out with a certain degree of a puzzling nature to them. You know, you have to figure out what's going on and then how you're going to deal with what's going on. They also have an element of this very whimsical, a bunch of friends are investigating something that is at least a little bit seemingly supernatural. Now, in the case of Disintegration Street, unlike the Scooby series, it is actually supernatural in nature. Ghosts and regular people live together on Disintegration Street. That is a core part of the premise. So that part is not a mystery. Why it happens and why kids disappear in this town, that is the mystery. And at this point, at volume 5, that mystery is almost entirely resolved. I say almost because there are still some revelations about it in this volume. Problem is, when you have more and more battles in your story, more and more clarity to understand what's happening in those battles. Sometimes art in here is not always clear. Some of this is a matter of dropped panels where I'm not entirely sure how two things connect directly to each other, which is more important in the actual physical battles that take place and less important in things like the dream sequence that I just showed you. But in order to really play up the sense of tension and give and take in a battle, I think it would have been better to have bigger panels, because page is so small, it can be hard to see what exactly is going on a page this size, and also be just a little more setup and payoff. To give an example of, especially the latter, but really both. Here is a two-page fight sequence. I mean, there's more pages than this, actually. But it can be kind of hard to see how some of these things flow from one another, especially here on top of this page, where we just see people doing a thing and reacting to it in the same frame. One thing I've come to really appreciate about the way manga illustrates a fight scene is you will see a panel for the setup and then a panel for the payoff. A great example of this in Western comics is actually when Superman meets Spider-Man. I forget the name of that particular crossover issue, but if you read that, there is a lot of showing the wind-up of a hit before it impacts. And that really makes the pacing of a fight scene flow a lot better, in my opinion. And there's not a whole lot of that in Disintegration Street. I understand why that may be the case. There's a page count, and there is the question of real estate on the page. Already, these panels are pretty small on the page we have to read them in. But in that case, you know, given the medium you're working in, these very small pages, and the fact that you want to tell a lot of action stories, you know, you have to ask yourself, how do I want to panel that? I would have personally preferred to pay another $1 or $2 for another 10 to 15 pages and gotten, you know, more of that, more panels to show the setup and the payoff. Now, I know that's a lot of work for the artist. I do illustrate comics as well, you know, more as a hobby right now than something I offer to the public, although one of these days. That kind of setup and payoff is much more satisfying to read. And it's really probably my only critique for the art in here, beyond the subjective stylistic issue and the fact that on a page of this size, it comes off as a little cramped. And that, again, stems from the fact that there's so much action in this. When we have these surrealist flashbacks or people are just talking, it works just fine. I think there is just a little bit of a question of the medium that Swan is working in and how he can best use it to tell his story. I don't think he's quite found that spot, especially as concerns his action. Writing-wise, I can't say a whole lot about this particular volume without spoiling things. So, what do I think of the writing in here? Well, it has a lot of the same kind of humor that the previous volumes had. Be a little bit to taste, be a little bit slapstick, and a little bit wonky. But there's not as much of it in here. This is the end of things, and Swan is more focused on paying off the things he's already set up, which I think is entirely appropriate. this story initially seems like it's going to revolve around a conflict between Mr. Mayor, the mayor of Disintegration Street, who died in a previous volume, but he was a human. And in Disintegration Street, ghosts and people together. So now they have to contend with Mr. Mayor's ghost. That is the initial plot hook and the plot hook that carries you from volume 4 to volume 5. It's a very interesting and compelling plot hook, but Mr. Mayor didn't really strike me as a to-go villain. Like he wasn't on that level. So I wasn't surprised when he was taken off the board early in the story. Everything that happens after Mr. Mayor is gone, quite interesting, and does a lot to finally put that capstone, that final summation on the fate of Disintegration Street, which I was really looking for in this story. It's tempting to say a lot of this book is denouement, but that is inaccurate. This book finally answering a lot of the questions about our protagonists that we've had up until this point. Who is Charlotte? Why is she important? Why did she wake up one day in Disintegration Street? Who's gone? Does he know Charlotte? What is the connection between the two? Because he's sought her out pretty regularly over the course of this story. What does this figurine that he found at the end of the previous volume have to do with Disintegration Street? Can the phenomena here be stopped? Or is it going to take over the whole world? We get all of these things wrapped up in a pretty satisfying set of answers. I have to admit, I didn't see this coming, but I also wasn't theory crafting too much about it. And if there's one critique I could offer, Swan, and I don't know, I didn't reread the previous volumes before this. One thing I should praise Swan for is he has these really concise summary chapters that have done a pretty good job bringing me back up to speed when each new volume comes out. I think I only went back and reread the series when I got volume 3, just to kind of get a running start into it. So it's been a while since I've read the first 3 volumes. But I don't recall there being a great deal of setup for the payoff we get here beyond the relationship as we've seen it between Gon and Charlotte. And that is a pretty good start to a setup, but I don't think it's a setup in its entirety. I could have used a little bit more. And this is a very subjective and tricky thing to do in a story that is about a mystery. It's very hard to set up a foreshadowing that is satisfying but doesn't tip your hand to the readers. And in a mystery, there is a question. Is it better that the readers can figure it out for themselves before everything goes down? Or is it better to be frustratingly vague and have readers be surprised? I was never frustrated with the vagueness of Disintegration Street. I just would have liked a little bit more foreshadowing. So that tells me Swan was almost exactly at the point where I would have been entirely satisfied. So this is not a very strong critique, in my opinion. Stronger critiques against Disintegration Street are those that I've always raised before. The humor and the mix of it, transition between humor and horror, may not work for all audiences. I only found it jarring, I think, in the first volume. I don't know if Swan became more deft with it, which is what I suspect, or if I just got used to it. But either way, it hasn't really bothered me since that first volume. I think he handles it quite well. But again, I recognize this is a very subjective line. It's difficult to walk it. Again, the first volume is where you're going to get the answers to that question. All I can really say is if you've read the first volume already and you found it not to your liking, I can't recommend Disintegration Street Volume 5 to you because it is more of the same, just at a greater level of refinement, paying off everything you got in that first volume. If you have read that and you enjoyed it, you're going to enjoy Volume 5. Again, while the balance of things is a little bit different here, it is more of what you got there, just more refined, and again, paying off all the setup. If you're out on a limb on this, I guess the genre mixing of Scooby-Doo with the friend element and the investigation element and the slapstick element, mixed with the kind of puzzly supernatural battles you see in something like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure appeals to you, then this is definitely going to be right up your alley. It doesn't hit either of those elements as strongly as those two series do, because it is, a single volume is a pretty condensed experience. It doesn't have as much space to deal with either of those ideas. But blended together, they make something different and interesting, which you may enjoy. So if those things combined in that way sound interesting to you, definitely check it out. If neither of those things sound appealing to you, avoid it entirely. Only enjoy one of those things. It's much harder to say whether you would enjoy Disintegration Street or not. I would suggest trying Volume 1 or Volume 3, depending on what you prefer. If you're into the mystery side of things, Volume 1 is where you're going to get hooked or not. If you're into the battling side of things, Volume 3 will give you an idea of what Swan is actually capable of. And it stands fairly well on its own, as I recall. And then you can go back and you can catch up on the mystery elements and then follow it through to the conclusion. So, Volume 5 on its own, don't recommend. I recommend you do one of the things I've already suggested to get a sense of the series, then decide whether you want Volume 5 or not. Let's talk spoilers. Biggest spoiler in here, that Disintegration Street lives up to its name. It's gone by the end of this story. I like this for two reasons. First of all, it puts a definitive cap on the story. I believe stories should have a clear endpoint. Now, not all of the characters here are gone. This is a horror story, so most of them are gone. But there are a couple still out there that we may see again, other Brenden Swan projects. As I said, there have been a little bit of crossover already. Dr. Stone escaped from Disintegration Street already in this story. And now one of our main characters also escapes. The human girl, Lillian. She's the only one, which, okay, not terribly surprising. You might think it would be Charlotte. Charlotte would be the final girl because she's the one on the covers. She's the main character. But we learn why she isn't here. The relationship between Charlotte and Gon, the reveal that Charlotte is essentially the spirit of the figurine Gon finds, that Gon is the original person to find this figurine, really clears up some of the very natural dynamic that's been between these two characters. They've always seemed to be very comfortable with each other, even though they've only met just recently. I assume that was part of the buddy story of the buddy side of the story elements, but now we see that it also plays into the horror aspect. I like that it bridges the two halves of the story quite organically. The flashback sequence where we see the previous history between Gon and Charlotte, their incarnations as, and the names have just slipped away from me, so I'm not gonna try and pull them out. But they had previous identities before the power of Disintegration Street trapped them in this cycle of death and rebirth, and they had a very interesting relationship there. I think it's explored just about the right amount. Get a sense of who they are to each other, get a sense of the emotional connection and what eventually tore them apart. We don't wallow in it, which some of these kind of stories can do on occasion. Swan avoids that, and it's commendable. I've already made my critiques of the action sequences here visually, but some of them, especially one between Amy the robot and Gon when he is in his final form, seem kind of like Deus Ex Machinas. Amy uses a piece of the Chrome ghost. I forget her name now off the top of my head. But there was a ghost who had the power to turn things to chrome when she touched them, and Amy has a piece of her which she uses against Gon, and that feels kind of like a I don't want to say an ass pull, but it feels like it comes out of nowhere. We know that Amy has the ability to use multiple ghost powers. That's part of the nature of the robots that Stone built. I just kind of would have liked that to be a little more clearly set up, at least in this volume. It may have been set up in volume 4. I didn't go back and reread this, as I said. Reread that volume for this video, as I said. So I would have at least liked maybe a brief flashback to make that clear. As it is, it just feels like a random element. That probably the biggest aspect of this. There is a setup and payoff with Mr. Mayer's sword that I think is pretty good, actually. It gives Lillian a big damn heroes moment in this story, which is something she has never gotten before, really. I like seeing that from her. And it gives her a sense of this is really the kind of person who could go to a place like Disintegration Street and survive. The ending of this is suitably bittersweet. I think this picture here of the remains of Disintegration Street with Charlotte's face in the sky and this little flower sprouting there in blue that she had in her first incarnation before Disintegration Street entered this weird loop is a nice touch. The ending is, I think, suitably open-ended. We get all the answers to who these people were, how they came together in this way, and what they did about it. We don't get a lot of answers about what Disintegration Street was, why the power functioned this way, where the doll came from, how it interacts with power, why it wants the souls of children to generate power. All of those things are left appropriately vague. This is ultimately a horror story where the villains of the story really probably shouldn't be explained too clearly to us, so that the next time we see them, and I suspect we will see at least something like Charlotte and the doll in other Swan stories. So next time we see them, we shouldn't know too much about what to expect from them. And I think he did a really good job leaving us with a satisfying emotional ending for all of the characters, but a nice open-ended loop where he can fill in more stuff and keep the elements here going if he so chooses. Honestly, from what I've seen of Swan's other work, that's really not necessary, but everyone likes to make callbacks to their previous stories, and as it is, I think Swan can do that without writing himself too much into a corner. All in all, I like the resolution of Disintegration Street. I like the exploration of some of the unfinished character themes, especially for Jeffrey, I believe, was Elise's father. Double check that. Oh, he's not here on this panel. Thought he was. Oh yeah, there it is. Jeffrey. So yeah. And I like the payoff for that. And for Elise, the ghost that has been kind of safeguarding Charlotte through this whole story. That was very interesting. But most of the story focuses on Gon and Charlotte. I think that's appropriate. They were the people we knew the least about. For the first 4 volumes of this story, we see the world entirely through Charlotte's eyes. But Charlotte doesn't spend a whole lot of time in self-reflection. So having the final volume all about her and the dynamic between her and Gon and who they were in the past is a perfect culmination of exploring Disintegration Street before it vanishes forever. And while I find it very satisfying that Disintegration Street is gone, I hope Brenden Swan will not be, because I do look forward to seeing more stories, more of what he can do. His storytelling, things like Strangelove and the other Dr. Stone story, name of which escapes me at the moment. But the kind of storytelling he did there is very quirky and very interesting, especially to me as someone who enjoys looking at the structure and technique of story. I'm looking forward to your next work, Mr. Swan. Very good work on Disintegration Street. Let me know what you think if you've read the whole series down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.